As I mentioned in my last video, I've been on a bit of a Dev Patel kick. So when Chase Wells Productions mentioned his inclusion in 2 new Netflix shorts in his Wes Anderson ranking, I figured I'd go and check them out. Poison, the topic of today's video, caught me off guard, shall we say. The story is simple. A man finds himself to have a venomous snake laying on top of him that neither he nor his compatriot, the author-inserter of the story, can see. The story follows the two of them figuring out how to rid the afflicted Harry of the snake. They end up enlisting the help of a local doctor, Dr. Ganderby, who comes up with solutions. First, he injects Harry with an anti-venom, so if the snake does bite, he has a chance of survival. He then instructs the author to go and grab chloroform from his house, so that he can use it to lull the snake to unconsciousness. Second poison of the story. After that, he and the author go to carefully get the snake from Harry's body, but it isn't there. To lighten the mood, the doctor jokes, but Harry takes it the wrong way and starts calling the doctor terrible, awful racial slurs. And the author begs him to stop. The doctor quickly leaves, as he should, and the author follows after him, attempting to profusely apologize on Harry's behalf. But the doctor merely replies, "You can't be." And he drives off, and the story ends. And I'm left there wondering why the story feels hollow, or at least my reaction to it. I felt this sense of profound importance, like the story said something, but I can't seem to hear it. There was such intensity up until that point, and when it ends, there's a sense of not catharsis, but like something was left hanging. What did the ending even have to do with poison? So I tried looking it up, going to Wikipedia, the different summaries to try, and too long didn't read the meaning. It was there in plain sight, and I'd heard Harry's racist remarks. So why did it feel so forced? Then I realized too late. The snake had already struck, and I'd mistaken a scarlet snake for a coral one. The most obvious of truths. Racism and colorism may be twins, but they're not the same thing. I feel the need to explain myself before we continue further as to why I'm even making this video in the first place. I mean, it's such an obvious realization. Of course the issue isn't whether or not the doctor is dark enough for whatever, for Harry's racist remarks. But why did I think that for even a moment? Why, when I thought I myself was shining through the other side of othering racism that I grew up with, when I was becoming such a proper leftist, did I fall for such an obvious red herring? Why did I still think that racism needed logic? If you've already seen Poison, you may know that there's actually something I left out. Something that ties the story together. And that is, of course, the setting and the actors who are playing these characters. You see, the story takes place in a British-occupied India circa the 1940s, and that influences the casting of the characters, too. The protagonist and the doctor are both played by British Indian actors, specifically Dev Patel and Ben Kingsley, respectively. And Harry himself was played by a white British man, Benedict Cumberbatch. It was all starting to come together, knowing these things. And there's more to it, of why a director would make the decision to cast these characters this way. You see, in my mind, some of these facts made sense as to why somebody would do this casting this way. For instance, British had been occupying India for about a century at that point, starting in 1858, according to Britannica. The Indian caste system, which is pretty widely well known, was actually influenced by Britain's own racism and colonialist ideas. You see, in a PBS article that asked experts on the subject about India's caste system, Audrey Smedley had this to say. Their inherited inequality was originally based on a religious system. Secondly, the thing about the caste system in India is that it wasn't based on morphology or skin color. The British were the ones who tried to introduce this by attempting to elevate the light-skinned Brahmin people into positions of power, giving them Western education. And this tended to solidify the caste system in India and give it another meaning. Other sources agree that India's caste system was in fact religious in origin. Sanjoy Chakravorty had this to say in his BBC article about the topic. First, the caste system is a fourfold categorical hierarchy in the Hindu religion. This system is ordained by Hinduism's sacred texts, notably the supposed source of Hindu law, the Manusmriti. It is thousands of years old, and it governed all key aspects of life, including marriage, occupation, and location. Sanjay explains later in the article how the British put their own twist on this. The colonizers invented or constructed Indian social identities using categories of convenience during a period that covered roughly the 19th century. This was done to serve the British Indian government's own interests, primarily to create a single society with a common law that could be easily governed. Unsurprisingly, America had actually been doing a similar thing for years. After spending decades importing stolen people to their land, America's hand was eventually forced to set these people free. And by that I mean they put a loophole into their amendment that clarified you could enslave people as legal punishment, which of course satisfied both sides and ended the Civil War. The 13th Amendment reads as follows. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. But America has this problem of building their infrastructure around the disenfranchisement of Black people and, of course, other people of color, just to say it isn't there. It became so pervasive, in fact, that Black people started using the paper bag test, when they turned away anyone darker than a brown paper bag as a judge of whether or not other Black people could join social gatherings, such as churches and sororities, as mentioned by Audrey Elisa Kerr in her article, The Paper Bag Principle of the Myth and Origin of Colorism. Whilst the two are often conflated or confused, racism and colorism are two ugly twins, born of the same mother, white supremacism. Racism derives its power from an us versus them mentality, with the us being whoever the British or Americans decided who's white enough to be white today. Colorism, on the other hand, lends itself to being an enforcer, using logical reasoning of paleness and levels of melanin to decide who is better than someone else. Both derive on some level, at least from a simple logic. Imagine a world before the one we know now, back when ancient people were just starting to form society. In capitalism's earliest cries, it started as simple as this: a division between those who work and those who own. As we know, or as you may learn, the production of melanin in the skin is actually just a simple matter of evolution. Earliest humans didn't have sunscreen, but they needed protection from harmful UV radiation. If you've ever heard the phrase, black don't crack, this is why actually. Sun damage is what leads to aging lines, for example, and the darker your skin is, the less UV light it allows to enter your skin barrier. This is why if you ever look at a map based on skin color, such as this one, you may notice the darkest skin tones overall are the ones closest to the equator, otherwise known as Earth's closest point to the sun. The farther from the equator, the less melanated their skin would need to evolve to be, because they would go from needing to block UV rays due to overexposure to needing paler skin to soak up nutrients such as vitamin D more quickly, when more of their body would be covered due to harsher winters, colder climates, and also because people would be indoors more. Therefore, race is simply a question of how much time you spend in the sun. Thus, back to my earlier example. In those early days, more hard labor in the sun meant darker skin, versus more time indoors due to not working outside meant paler skin, and therefore a false dichotomy. Whiteness or less melanated skin ended up becoming a sign of wealth, whereas darker or more melanated skin ended up becoming a sign of poverty and lower intelligence. Which leads back to my original perception. When watching Wes Anderson's retelling of Poison, he uses that logic against you. The narrator is visibly darker, and unless you're like me and looked up Ben Kingsley's origin, you may not have actually even known that he was Indian in the first place. Our association with paleness equaling race leads us to a false conclusion. That this act wasn't justified because it doesn't make sense. Because it's not logical. And that's the thing about things like racism and colorism. They pretend to be steeped in fact, backed by science. When really, they're just ideas that we propped up really high and decided meant something. The power of racism isn't colorism. It's our belief that race at all exists in the first place. Now is the point of the video where I really need to clarify. I am not saying the cultural idea of race doesn't exist. Like, Indians aren't real, they're just native to America. Kidding. More seriously though, cultures of people do exist. People are native to certain places, find their history and meanings from their culture, and that is very valid and worth knowing and acknowledging. Racism doesn't mean you can't be proud of a culture that means something to you. It means that you can't base your sense of worth, of being, and pride on how pale you are or aren't. It's about not letting the world divide you into an us when there isn't a them. When I was younger, I was raised on the belief that America was a melting pot, a place where you could come as you are, come from somewhere, start from nothing, and become a success. You could find a sense of accomplishment, a place in the world that you may not have found otherwise. What my history books failed to mention was, well, obviously the lie of capitalism and how it only really works for people who have generational wealth, which is an entire different video topic, but more importantly, why were people fleeing their homes to America in the first place? You know, America actually has a history of putting its fingers in other people's countries, influencing their elections and political leaders, even using companies to fund colonization like in Hawaii, or, you know, creating a country from scratch. Ugh. My point is that America has its tendency, on top of other colonizers like Britain, to divide its people into categories and then lie about the categories existing in the first place. I spent my life believing America was maybe a bit wonky in places, but built on a solid foundation. But it's not, because it was built to disenfranchise anyone who isn't white or able-bodied or male or cisgendered. In fact, the entire system was made this way on purpose. Sure, Some pieces of media are simply made for enjoyment. But all of them, intentionally or not, are sending a message. This one bit me like a snake in the grass, and its story hiding beneath beautiful sets and imagery, and all I can wonder is, what do I do with this? The world is on fire right now, and sometimes I can't tell if it's burning to ashes or simply destroying what can no longer exist. And I hope that idea, what I just said, doesn't come off wrong. I'm not trying to make things like what's happening in Palestine and the Congo seem okay, because yay, it means capitalism is dying. I get it. I just simply believe that, like most human experiences, this one is missing hope. Hope that has spent the last several months being shattered beyond recognition, but still worth picking up every time. I've started to see the world rally together for the most beautiful ideas. The idea that slavery, colonization, and even more are finished, never to be done again in the name of convenience or a quick buck, and I just want this to be a reminder. With poisons like racism, it's hard to know if one can survive it. It can leave you wondering if far-right extremism is inevitable, if it's based on where you're born or the people you surround yourself with. But I find, personally, that it's more of a virus, one you can boost your immunity against, but the fight is never really over. Flu season comes again every year, and racism is an ugly disease that rampages, giving an easy solution to very ugly, complicated questions. But that struggle is not a reason to stop trying, but a reminder to keep fighting against it. Resistance means that you're trying. And the world needs more try and less give up. Less surrendering to what is. Dying to a snake bite isn't inevitable, but giving up, inviting the snake to bed, and quietly surrendering to its bite is. So please, don't stop fighting. We still need you. And that's where I wanted the story to end. But I kind of missed something else vital to the story. I'm not sure where this will go or how I'll put it in, but to write all of this and not mention Dahl's real-life racism and anti-Semitism would be a mistake. As with other children's authors like J.K. Rowling, separating art from the artist and meaning from intention is difficult to navigate. It's like trying to eat a pie made of shit. Looking good doesn't keep it from tasting and smelling like ass. These authors carry complicated legacies, and it's important not to ignore them. JKR still owns Harry Potter trademark, and her influence on the recent game that came out, Hogwarts Legacy, has of course been noted to be actively anti-Semitic. As Stacey Henley reports, it turns out the villains of this game, Hogwarts Legacy, are the goblin bankers. You know, the gold-loving creatures with hooked noses and beady rat-like eyes who display the Star of David on their murals. All of which are known anti-Semitic stereotypes. Oh cool, a game about hunting Jewish caricatures. Truly, Game of the World material. And Roald Dahl has done similar things in his work, like originally making the Oompa Loompas African pygmies, Willy Wonka shipped to England and paid in cocoa beans, you know, the ones used to make chocolate. Other examples are his original draft of the BFG, or Big Friendly Giant. Historian Donald Yakovone says, "The big friendly giant at the center of that book emerged as the worst possible imitation of a Zip Coon figure. A black, flat-nosed giant with thick, rubbery lips, like two gigantic purple frankenfurters lying on top of each other. Jacobone even continues to say, for once, an editor, Roxborough, who later edited The Witches and Matilda, spoke up, properly denounced Dahl's characterization as a derisive stereotype, and eventually, and seemingly begrudgingly, Dahl relented and rewrote the giant. Death of the author, a literary idea that argues that the meaning of text is not determined by the author's intention, but rather by the reader's interpretation, has been brought up in regards to many authors throughout the years, least of all Dahl. This phenomenon, taking a previously bigoted work and reworking it to mean something arguably wholesome, maybe just more impactful, reminds me a lot of why I was originally in the Harry Potter fandom. So it comes to mind to wonder how Dahl could write so negatively and vitriolically even about Black and Jewish people, all while writing a book about the poisons of colorism. I wondered how much of this was Dahl and how much of this was Wes Anderson and crew who adapted the story. In Stephen Gonson's article reflecting on the Netflix quartet, he says this: from the first film and its vivid colors and altruistic themes to the bleak finale of Poison, it feels as if Anderson is making a statement about the difficulties in which to regard Dahl and his cultural legacy. And that, to me, says something rather significant. The idea of taking a work of someone who was a known bigot and reworking it to mean something more important. There have been many fans who have taken Rowling's ideas and turned them into a different direction, similarly to Wes Anderson in this case. Some of my favorites are actually the ones where Harry, the main character who's mistreated by the Dursleys for seemingly no reason, and being of both the wizarding and normal worlds, being portrayed as half Indian. Or Hermione, a character with frizzy hair and a desire to free an enslaved race, being rewritten as Black. So much nuance can be explored through these re-understandings of art. And sometimes art is less about who made it and more about those who enjoy it. This isn't to say go out and buy the newest Harry Potter merch when that money still goes to Rowling. But maybe read fanfictions about how this world could have been better. I honestly find that that's the best way to enjoy some media, especially shows like Supernatural, Doctor Who, and BBC Sherlock.